Something is collapsing inside the modern human gut. Inflammatory bowel disease has tripled in the last 3 decades. 1 in 7 adults now lives with chronic digestive disorders. Metabolic disease linked to gut dysfunction affects nearly half the adult population in industrialized nations. And the leading hypothesis in gastroenterology is not a virus, not a gene. It is the disappearance of something humans ate every single day for 900 years and stopped eating almost entirely within 1 generation. In 988 AD, a chronicle recording the baptism of Prince Vladimir of Kievan Rus listed 3 things distributed to the people: food, honey, and kvass. Kvass, a fermented bread drink, listed alongside food itself as if it were as fundamental as eating. It was. And the recipe for making it, along with 2 other categories of fermented foods that medieval monasteries produced daily, was considered such valuable institutional knowledge that religious orders kept it secret until the 19th century. This video is about what was inside those recipes and what we lost when we stopped using them. Why the specific combination monks used outperforms anything modern science currently sells. That answer comes later. First, you need to understand the system. Medieval monastery fermentation was not accidental. It was a system running simultaneously across 3 distinct categories, every single day, for centuries. Most people today supplement with 1 type of probiotic, 1 brand, 1 product, containing 2 to 10 bacterial strains from 1 or 2 species. Medieval monks consumed hundreds of strains across multiple species before breakfast. Here is how the system worked. Category 1. Grain ferments. Kvass from rye bread, sourdough from wheat, fermented ale from barley. Targeting the upper digestive system, small intestine and proximal colon. Category 2. Dairy ferments. Fermented milk preparations, equivalent to modern kefir, plus aged monastery cheeses ripened for months or years. Targeting the mid and lower colon with lactobacillus and bifidobacterium strains, most studied for immune modulation. Category 3. Vegetable ferments. Lacto-fermented cabbages, turnips, beets, and onions preserved through winter months. Targeting the lower colon with Lactobacillus plantarum, the bacterial strain most associated in clinical research, with maintaining gut lining integrity and reducing intestinal permeability. 3 categories. 3 regions of the gut, covered simultaneously. Every day. This was not a wellness trend. This was how monasteries ate. The system persisted for 900 years because the outcomes were consistent and observable across generation after generation of monks. When that system was dismantled, when monasteries across Europe were dissolved during the Reformation and the Enlightenment, something was permanently lost. What exactly disappeared? And what it cost us? In a moment. The first category, grain ferments. Monks called kvass živoy, alive. The process begins with dark rye bread dried, sometimes toasted, then submerged in warm water with a natural starter. Wild yeasts and lactic acid bacteria present on the grain surface begin consuming the sugars. Within 12 to 48 hours, the liquid becomes mildly carbonated, slightly sour, and biologically dense with lactobacillus bacteria, Saccharomyces yeasts, and B vitamins synthesized during fermentation. What monks called alive, modern microbiology now quantifies. Probiotic concentrations in traditional kvass are comparable to commercial probiotic drinks, with the critical advantage of arriving inside a food matrix, not a capsule, meaning higher bacterial survival through stomach acid and more complete establishment in the gut microbiome. The monastery sourdough starter compounded this further. A sourdough starter maintained for decades, as monastery starters accumulates microbial diversity that cannot be replicated by a starter made last week. Some monastery starters were older than the monks tending them. The microbial community inside a decades-old sourdough culture is, in biological terms, ancestral. Sourdough fermentation also transforms wheat in ways that industrial bread processing is physiologically incapable of replicating. It reduces phytate content, increasing mineral absorption by up to 50%. It partially predigests gluten proteins, reducing the systemic inflammatory response in sensitive individuals. And it produces organic acids that lower the glycemic index of the bread itself, reducing post-meal metabolic and inflammatory spikes. Monks ate this bread at every meal, every day. Not as a choice, as a rule. When the monasteries were dissolved, their sourdough starters, living cultures maintained across generations, were abandoned. Their kvass recipes, classified as institutional secrets, were lost with the institutions that held them. A fermentation tradition 900 years deep was interrupted in a single generation. The health consequences of that interruption are now measurable in the epidemiological record. The second category, dairy ferments. In 2024, researchers from the Chinese Academy of Sciences published findings in Cell, and one of the most selective scientific journals in the world. They had extracted intact, complete genomes of Lactobacillus kefiranofaciens from cheese samples found in a 3,500-year-old Bronze Age tomb at Xiaohe Cemetery in Xinjiang. Not fragments, not traces, complete bacterial genomes. Preserved in ancient dairy, remains for 3.5 millennia. What this finding means: Lactobacillus kefiranofaciens and human populations have been in continuous symbiotic relationship for at least 3,500 years. This bacterium did not accidentally become beneficial to human gut health. It evolved alongside us, developing across thousands of years of cohabitation, precisely the functional properties that make it so effective at modulating immunity, supporting gut lining integrity, and reducing inflammatory markers in clinical research. Medieval monks were delivering this 3,500-year-old symbiont to their gut every single day. In fermented milk, in aged cheese. Monastery cheese was aged for months to years, dramatically longer than most modern commercial production. Extended aging concentrates beneficial bacterial strains and completes predigestion of milk proteins in ways that fresh dairy cannot. In every monastery medical text, aged cheese was classified as more medicinal than fresh cheese. Not as food, as medicine. Modern fermented dairy research consistently confirms what those texts recorded. The third category, lacto-fermented vegetables. This is the category most missing from modern diets, and according to recent clinical research, possibly the most critical for preventing the chronic inflammation that drives metabolic disease, digestive disorders, and immune dysfunction. Monastery lacto-fermentation required nothing but vegetables, salt, and thyme. Cabbages, turnips, beets, and onions were packed into clay crocks, submerged in their own brine, and left to ferment through winter. No vinegar, no heat, no intervention. The naturally occurring Lactobacillus plantarum on the vegetable surfaces did the rest. Here is the fact that should change how you read every label in a supermarket. Most commercial sauerkraut, pickles, and fermented vegetables are pasteurized, heat-treated. Pasteurization kills all bacteria, including every beneficial strain the fermentation process created. A pasteurized jar of commercial sauerkraut contains 0 live bacteria, 0 colony-forming units. You are eating the corpse of a fermentation process, not a living one. The monastery preparation, no heat, no pasteurization, salt, and thyme, only preserved every living Lactobacillus plantarum strain that clinical research has now confirmed reduces intestinal permeability, lowers TNF-alpha and interleukin-6, and supports the gut mucus layer that separates your bloodstream from your gut contents. Medieval monks consumed this living preparation through every winter month, October through April, for their entire lives. 6 months of daily, food-sourced, prebiotic-accompanied Lactobacillus plantarum delivery. Every year, for decades. Modern research confirms that food-sourced probiotics outperform supplement-sourced probiotics in gut establishment rates. The food matrix delivers bacteria alongside their own fuel. The capsule does not. The monks were running an optimized probiotic delivery system. They called it preserving vegetables for winter. Now the answer to the question planted at the beginning. Why does the 3-category system outperform any single fermented food or probiotic supplement? The gut is not a uniform environment. The small intestine, proximal colon, and distal colon each maintain different pH levels, different oxygen concentrations, and entirely different dominant bacterial communities. No single fermented food colonizes all 3 regions. No probiotic supplement containing 2 to 10 strains covers the ecological complexity of a healthy human gut microbiome. The monastery system was accidentally, and then deliberately, through 900 years of observed outcomes, engineered to cover the full spectrum. Grain ferments for the upper tract. Dairy ferments for the mid-colon. Vegetable ferments for the lower colon. In 2021, Stanford School of Medicine published the FEFA trial in Cell. 36 adults. High fermented food diet versus high fiber diet. 10 weeks. The fermented food group showed decreased levels of 19 separate inflammatory proteins in blood samples. Microbiome diversity increased. 4 types of immune cells showed measurably less activation. The critical finding: it was not the quantity of any single fermented food that drove these results. It was the diversity of fermented food types. Greater diversity of categories produced the greatest reduction in chronic inflammation markers. Medieval monks had been running this exact protocol for 900 years before Stanford ran it for 10 weeks and arrived at the same conclusion. 900 years against 10 weeks. The outcomes were identical. The modern equivalent of the monastery fermentation system requires 3 specific choices, 1 per meal. Breakfast: authentic sourdough bread made with wild starter, not commercial yeast. Or water kefir if you prefer a drink. Both deliver grain ferment lactobacillus strains to the upper digestive tract. Midday: milk kefir, not yogurt kefir. Yogurt contains 2 to 4 bacterial strains. Milk kefir contains 30 or more, including Lactobacillus kefiranophaciens, the same strain found intact in a 3,500-year-old tomb. 1 cup is sufficient. Evening meal: raw, unpasteurized sauerkraut or kimchi. If it is refrigerated and labeled raw or unpasteurized, it contains live bacteria. If it sits on a room temperature shelf, it has been pasteurized and contains none. 2 to 4 tablespoons alongside your meal. 3 categories. 3 meals. 3 different regions of the gut supported daily. This is not a complicated protocol. Monks did not experience it as complicated. They experienced it as breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The fermentation code was not a code to them. It was simply how food worked. The gut protocol. The fermentation code. Next week, the 3rd piece of the system. A plant that grows in monastery gardens across Europe, classified today as a common vegetable that modern immunology has confirmed, suppresses the inflammatory cascade through 3 separate biological pathways simultaneously. Pharmaceutical companies have studied its active compounds in depth. They cannot patent a plant. The knowledge was never lost. It was just waiting. I will see you next week.